Okay, welcome back, everyone, to the Board of Curators meeting. It was great to visit with the students from Missouri S&T and university leaders during lunch. I'm now pleased to turn over the podium to our General Counsel, Mark Mangini, who is going to discuss board governance and professionalism. We encourage questions and discussion during this presentation. So I turn it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Curator Chapman. Can you hear me okay with this? Yes. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about board governance and professionalism. Daryl asked me to put together a presentation for the meeting today and reflect upon my experience and also the information that's out there in the world on best practices for governance and professionalism on boards. So what this is more of a general guideline for best practices. And what I mean by that is you can go type into Google board governance, best practices, board professionalism, best practices, and you'll get 500 different articles that when you weed through them are all going to say about the same things essentially. And those themes are throughout this presentation today, certainly. But what I also try to do was reflect on my own experience and put my own lens on my experience working with boards and sitting on boards and how those experiences shape the way I look at how boards should govern, what I think best practices should be, and what I think best professionalism should be on a board level. So what's my lens? I sat 5 years on the board of directors at Greensfelder, Hemker & Gale, which is a 170 attorney law firm, regional law firm out of St. Louis, Missouri. I sat on their executive committee as well, had a lot of people reporting to us during the normal course of board meetings, and made the sausage at the board level for the firm. When I left there in 2013, I went to Asian Corporation, a public company in Chesterfield, and I reported to and worked with a board of directors, independent board of directors for that public company for 8 years. I saw it from two different angles while I was at Asian, and that's what's influenced a lot of the points I'm going to bring up today. I saw it from the angle of being someone that actually reported to the board, prepared presentations, prepared board books, worked with my executive colleagues to prepare presentations and respond to board questions. Get ready for the board meetings, attend the board meetings, and prepare and present to that board. I also saw it from the flip side of managing the board of directors as the general counsel of the company and working with them to achieve their strategic objectives as a board, understanding why their calendar was set up the way it was, why their schedule was set up the way it was, why the initiatives they had in place were the initiatives that they wanted to see presented upon by executives from the company. And that gave me a different perspective than just the perspective of reporting to the board. So the comments you're going to hear today are largely influences by both sides of that, as well as all the material you'll find when you do the Google search. So I'll start by saying, before we flip slides, no two boards are built the same. Certainly, every board is different. Every board has different influencing factors that go into why that board makes certain decisions, how that board interacts with its executive management, and how that board governs generally, big G generally. So there is no one-size-fits-all. This is just a best practices general guideline. And a lot of the things we're going to talk about, as I found out in the first 2.5 weeks on the job with the university, are things we're already doing and doing well. I think there are a few things that we could do better or that we could think about doing differently, and we'll talk through those as we go through the presentation. So, as Curator Chapman said, this is a discussion. This is not a lecture. I'm not here to preach to anybody. Please don't take it that way. I'm here to introduce some thought-provoking comments. Next slide, please. Okay, so first slide is big picture. You need to define how the board will work and then provide the appropriate oversight. So what does that mean? So I like to start by saying every board needs to sit back and thoughtfully develop a set of values. I'm sure this board governs through a set of values, but not one that I have seen written down or presented to management. If there is such a set of values, I'll be happy to look at it. That set of values should be a pact between the board and a pact between the board and management. What do I mean by that? It should be how the board will interact with one another, what values they thoughtfully put down on paper to how they will interact with each other, and also how they will interact with executives and administration, and how they expect the administration to interact with them. Almost every set of values you'll ever see for a board will have the first word respect in it, defining how you will respect one another at the board level and defining how you will respect the administration that you work hand in hand with and that reports to you. Set of values will deal with open communication, will deal with trust, professionalism, diligence, what's expected of management. All of those, will have various variations, so to speak, at every board, but it is an exercise that I would encourage this board, if it has not done yet, to sit back and have a session where they think about, what's working well, what could work better, and be reflective of how they would like to govern and what values they would like management to follow when management deals with the board. It's a two-way street. And then you have to, once you set those values, expect them to be followed on a two-way basis. At my last employer, we had a five-point set of values that we created with management and the board. It was a joint effort. And every single agenda at the top had those 5 values set out. Not because people forgot about them, but because it was a reminder for the board members and for management. When you picked up an agenda for every meeting, it was just there in the background. You saw it, and it made you think, yes, we're going to act this way. This is the way we decided we're going to treat each other, and they did so accordingly. Second, board schedule. So every board should have a schedule. This board is no exception, and we certainly do. That schedule should be largely created to track with major initiatives of the administration, delegation of authority review, what's the effectiveness and reasonableness of it, when will we look at that on an annual basis, or if we'll look at it on an annual basis or 2-year basis, how the board and when the board will look at the compliance and risk management programs, what's the status of those programs, are they effective in the reporting structure to the board, assessing the processes that are in place to identify, monitor, and manage risk. Is it working? Are those very, very critical programs of compliance and risk working? That should be something that's done on an annual basis and should be carved out in your schedule. Board always needs to look at its structure, at least on an annual basis. How are we set up? How are our committees set up? Who is on our committees? What has worked in the prior 12 months? What could work better? And what changes can we make? Where do we have expertise on the board that's not being utilized at various committees where it could be utilized better? Those questions should all be asked on an annual basis with a thorough, thoughtful review of your committees. Senior management performance, of course, is something that needs to be analyzed every single year. And then short and long-term strategy is always going to be something you want to put somewhere into your board schedule that tracks with the administration's schedule when it comes to strategy. Next point is governance versus management. This is always a hot button. I'm not looking at you, Curator Winokur. This is always a hot button question. What does it mean to govern as a board member versus manage? It's hard to define, and so I'll use an analogy. And the analogy is ordering the sandwich. So a board member should think of governance and their duties as a governing board member as a person that walks into a deli and orders a sandwich. You go up to the deli, you talk to the person behind the counter, and you order a tuna on rye. Management would be jumping over the counter after you order it, going behind the deli counter, gathering up the team that's going to make that sandwich, who's going to prepare the tuna, who's going to slice the bread, what kind of cheese are we going to use and how thick's it going to be, celery's in it, who's going to chop the celery, is it going to be diced or is it going to be sliced, and how thin is it going to be sliced? Getting them together, setting that up, and then overseeing each person's process as they're making that sandwich. Obviously, this is an absurd analogy, but I'm hoping it illustrates the point. That's more management, that's not governance. And in my experience, where I've seen board members fall over the line from governance to management most typically is when those board members are either actively managing their own companies or acting as executives in a company as opposed to a retiree, or have just recently retired from active management in a company. It's very hard to switch that mindset from management to governance when you provide board oversight and governance. Again, I don't have a black line rule for the distinction, but it's something that I would encourage every board member to consider when those issues arise where they think about, am I governing or am I managing as a board member, and what that should look like. There is no one size fits all, and that is a very broad brush, and there are always going to be circumstances that come up where you're going to break the rule and you're going to manage a little bit more than govern. And that's going to be part of your job. It always is for every good, effective board. But maybe it shouldn't be every issue that comes up. And that's where you have to start sitting back and thinking about, am I governing or am I managing? And then finally, board committees. From a high level, every board should have detailed committees set up, and we'll go to the next slide and talk about that. Before we do, any questions on any of those points or comments? Again, I want this to be a discussion, not a lecture. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so committees need to be set up in the various functional areas that track with the administration in this case. And those committees should have detailed charters. They should have detailed schedules. And in my opinion, they should have a detailed specific delegation of authority. I'm going to step back. We have 5 committees here, and they all make sense to me, just in the small amount of time I've been here. They're exactly what I would expect to see for a university board: student affairs, audit and compliance, finance, governance, comp and HR, and health affairs. The members appear to be knowledgeable in their areas and appropriately set on those committees. Again, that's something that should be looked at every year, especially when the board refreshes with new members. The charters for those committees, in our case, they list specific functions and oversight for each committee, which is good. Of course, you want to have that. You want to detail in the charter for each committee what's it looking at, what's under its purview. Don't exactly have to explain why, but you should at least have the what in that charter. In our case, the committees are vested with oversight and then recommendation power. And I use that word power loosely because the charters themselves are set up for the committees to have oversight and then make recommendations to the board for approval for action. That's not a delegation of power, in my opinion, to the various committees on this board. I think a better practice is to sit back and thoughtfully think about what delegations of specific power the board is willing to make to each one of the committees so that they can act quicker, more efficiently, and more nimbly if that's a problem the board perceives. Not having been here more than 2 weeks, I don't know if it's an issue. I haven't spoken with administration, which is certainly a voice the board should be speaking with to determine whether or not they, meaning administration, is able to act nimbly and efficiently in conjunction with the powers and authority that the various committees have. Every year, the board should be looking at that DOA, Delegation of Authority for their committee, and say, we as a board are willing to delegate these specific powers to the committees because we look back at the past year and we see that these 5 issues come up routinely throughout the year. These are issues the administration brings to the board or to various committees. We know in talking with Dr. Choi or various administrators that those issues need to be acted on quickly in order for the university to continue to move forward efficiently and nimbly, which is very important in any business, and we are a business. When you look at that in that respect, then I think you can sit back and say, we're going to delegate, or we think we can delegate certain powers to those committees so that they can act with that delegated approval and move forward, and that the administration can move forward on their decisions. Much easier to constitute and bring together 3 or 4 people on a committee to make a decision than it is 9 people on this board. It can happen quicker, the decisions can be made, and the administration can move on.
Mark?
Yes?
Let me ask this. So let's say we did that and the committees were empowered, the authority was delegated and to make the decision. Does the board have have to put its final stamp of approval on that in the next meeting, or is it done?
So that's the distinction between ratification and approval, and it's a very difficult line to draw. But essentially, the way this would work is the committees would have delegated authority to make decisions that the administration then has confidence they can move forward under, those committees' decisions. The board then at each board meeting each board meeting will look back and ask each committee to present to it what decisions were made under the delegated authority, and the board would ratify those decisions. And the way to think about ratification versus approval is, yes, a ratification is an approval of the action, but it's an after the fact. It's basically saying a retrospective approval where we're formally declaring that we as the board have agreed with what our committees have done with their delegated powers, as opposed to an approval by the board, which is this cannot take effect until we approve it.
Michael?
Mark?
Oh, go ahead, Greg.
I'm sorry.
No.
I want to follow up on that for just a minute. If they have authority, but yet, do they have to get ratification? What if a committee gave authority, told management to go forward, and the board, under the ratification process, says, well, that was stupid, we aren't doing that. Now what happens?
One of two things. Yeah. So we're going to get to this in a second, but the board.
I can wait.
Right, no, it's all right. The board always has power to trump any decision by anybody that it's delegated authority to, whether that be a committee or whether it be administration. That's something that can never change. And so if it was a serious enough issue where the board said, committee, audit and compliance and ethics committee has done something that we just cannot agree with, we're going to override it, well, then let the chips fall where they may. If you override it, you have to push that back down to the administration and tell them you have to change course. We're overriding a committee's decision. Good governance, you don't want to do that too often because then nothing gets done. Everything gets pushed back all the way back to the board and everyone's afraid to make decisions and act on those decisions. But certainly, in that instance, Curator Hobrock, the board has the ability to reverse any committee action.
Okay, so I'll take finance. Let's just say you gave finance committee the authority to sign leases.
Okay.
And we signed the lease. Ryan says, hey, we need to sign this lease. Finance committee says, yeah, sign the lease. Signs the lease, come back for ratification to the board, and the board says, oh, no, we're not signing that lease. Now what happens? Now I've got a signed lease as a contractual obligation of the board. So at that point, we would just have to deal with the legal ramifications of not living up to the terms of the contract?
Yeah, you don't want to do that. I mean, I don't mean to be flip, but yeah, the board would never want to do that, right? And you would hope that you have the right people in place in the committees that are making the right decisions. And look, any committee that's going to make a decision is going to chat with Curator Chapman at some point and say, I just want you to know we're going forward with this decision, and take his temperature on it. You know, do you think this will be an issue for the board? And if it is, then call a board meeting. And I think most of you or all of you probably are familiar enough with how each one of you will think on various issues and whether or not this is one where we really need to take temperature in a full board meeting as opposed to the committee moving forward.
Okay.
But what you're really saying is that there's no purpose to have committees if you don't delegate authority.
Well, I'm
To
saying,
some extent.
I'm saying there's a purpose to have committees, but without delegated authority, those committees can't allow the administration to move as quickly and nimbly and effectively.
They're not working committees, really.
Right, that's correct. Yeah.
Michael,
Okay, yeah, theoretically, I understand what you're saying. And in a different context, I might even agree with what you're saying. I think in the context, at least in my head, and maybe I just, and I can't get, the problem I'm having with this is, at least as this board sits, is that the reason we have the committees is so you can do the deep dive. And that committee is supposed to present the information so that the 9 of us can figure out what the board should do. I think delegating that authority to gather information and come up with here's what we think you should do is fine. I think if you, let's do it on my side. And let's say, you know, a human in resources, I can tell Marcia, hey, gather this information. And then say, yeah, Marcia, this is the plan. No, because I think you have to have buy-in from the whole board. Because even on that committee, you're never going to have a quorum. And so I think it's different here because we don't have a quorum, so why would we let that committee proceed without having that quorum? And so that maybe I'm just conceptually having a problem with that, but that's kind of where I am.
And it's a good point. What I'm suggesting is not taking every bit of authority from the board and deciding where it gets delegated and delegating it all out.
Yeah.
What I am suggesting is sitting back and saying, okay, what are the routine issues that come up that aren't really hot button issues that the board is really that concerned with as a 9-person board each year throughout the year? And I'll just give you an example, and this may not apply to the administration here, but compensation. You know, where I came from, we had delegated to the compensation committee authority to approve compensation packages to new executives of anything that was over $350,000 a year in bonus and target salary. The delegation authority was that the administration could not give that contract unless the board approved it. So the administration knew which contracts needed board approval. There's a bright line there. And then the board said, we're not going to meet as a 7 or 8 person board every time one of these contracts comes in. We think that the comp committee can be entrusted to look at that and approve those so that the administration can go forward and bring that talent in without unnecessary delay. And the board, as a full board, decided we're comfortable with that. That's something that we don't think we have to be together, and we're willing to delegate down to a committee. And what I'm suggesting is that this board sit back and think of what those items are that it would be comfortable as a full board to delegate to a committee. Not every issue, but certainly I suspect there are a number of issues when you think about it and when you work with Dr. Choi and his management team to be thinking about what comes up routinely throughout the year that could be done more efficiently with a committee delegated power. Maybe the board says nothing. We can't think of one thing. I haven't been here long enough to tell you one way or another.
Ordering lunch.
Right, ordering lunch, there you go.
Let me, again, this whole concept is me just guessing here. Currently, if I have things, if I understand things correctly, we have delegated, the board has delegated everything to the running of the university, the president of the university, except for naming buildings and hiring, there's some hires that we do. But basically, the rest of these things have been delegated to the president, who then has delegated to the chancellors and to different people to operate forward. So at this stage of the game, would we not then be taking some of that power back up if we're going to give it to the committee? I'm trying to...
It's an excellent question. I'm not suggesting removing power from the administration, from Dr. Choi and the chancellors, the provosts. What I am suggesting is this board makes decisions throughout the year on various issues where maybe it's not a specifically delegated issue, or maybe it is, but the board has said, you know what, we want to have a weigh-in on this, because I think that'll happen from time to time if I'm reading things correctly. And I think the board just needs to stand back and say, all right, what did we decide as a board throughout the year that we didn't give full delegation to, or that we were really interested in, and whether those types of issues might more appropriately be vested with authority at the committee level. Curator?
Oh, no, she's trying to appease me. She's like, it's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think what the general counsel is saying is you may decide to leave everything the way it is, but let's take a look at it to see what can be delegated down, and it may be a few or maybe none.
That's absolutely right. And remember, this discussion today is more about a big picture best practice discussion, And as I've gotten in the chair here and looked at things, the first thing that struck me was the committees weren't delegated any powers. And so that was one thing I flagged immediately for discussion.
No, I'm sitting here thinking, in my mind, how we would inventory what those choices are. For example, tuition jumps out at me that's probably something we're all so invested in, and something that we all get asked enough about stays with the board. If I'm just...
You won't let me set tuition?
No. Not you solely. But, starting to think through. Now, I have a committee where we don't make a lot of decisions within the committee. It ends up kind of fed into other groups, the committee I'm chairing right now. So I'm just trying to process an inventory of what those choices are during the year. And I get the concept. I think I need to think about it as we make choices all through the year, which ones would go in which bucket or possibly to change. So.
And that's really the recommendation.
I get that. But you did catch me just tapping him on
Okay. Any other comments on committee delegations?
I've had this conversation 100 times in the last 7 years, 6 years, but you see we all meet together, and for most of these meetings, we're all together. It's almost odd to me to have a committee meeting in front of the full board. So, have no committees, or, to me, it resonates what you're saying, but I think at the end of the day, the question is whether there's any decisions we can, comfortably delegate, and that's the issue that you're pointing out, because if the answer is none, then it's none, but if there are some, and really, anytime something's a hot-button issue, I think it's a small enough board that we know that it can always be pulled back up to the full board, but Otherwise, it's, you know, it's like, I think of it as like a little league soccer game, you know, where all the kids are chasing the ball. You don't really have forwards and, you know, you don't have defense and you don't have a goalie. It's just everybody's running after the ball. So, you know, if we want to subdivide and, you know, put our teams in different positions, it seems to be like, it would be more like a working committee to me, but.
Yeah, and, you know, to that point, the way we're structured now, as you stated, is our schedule is these committees are meeting the same day as the full board, so the full board can listen to the same thing, and we do a little bit of theater between, okay, we're moving for the board to approve this, and the board says, yes, we approve it. But that discussion is all happening at the same time. A committee typically would have, I think as you know in your profession, those committees are going to be working off-cycle from board meetings. They're going to have off-cycle committee meetings that really more closely track the needs of the administration and the administration's schedule for various functional issues that come up during the year. And that's why, you know, when they're having those off-cycle committee meetings, that's where a delegation of authority really becomes more important, because they can make decisions and move on concurrent with the cycle of the administration that their committee meetings are set to, as opposed to waiting for each of the 4 or 5 board meetings and then bringing it all up at once.
It also allows the full board to meet on more strategic topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next slide, please. Same vein, delegation of authority to the administration. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, I think as we all know, ultimate authority rests with the Board of Curators, no matter what. No matter what's delegated, down to any level of the administration or to committees, et cetera, full and final authority always rests with this board. That's Missouri Constitution, that's Missouri State Statute, period. Now, as we know, many things that occur in the administration are powers that have been delegated down from the board to Dr. Choi, and then from Dr. Choi to others, as well as the bylaws that the faculties have put in place, have been ratified and put into the Code of Rules and Regulations. That's good governance, and I think the board is acting the way it should be acting when it delegates authority. Otherwise, nothing could ever get done. There's just too much that has to be decided. Best practice is to make sure that that's a clear delegation of authority. You know, I spent some time and went back through the CRRs, and I think I found 14+ specific areas of delegated authority, all of which make sense, all of which were detailed, and I think, if I'm understanding correctly, the administration is operating without issue with that delegation of authority. That's not to say that the board cannot insert itself if it deems necessary. The board has different factors that are influencing the board-level decisions on any particular issue that may come up, and it's always a possibility, because final authority rests with the board, that the board can insert itself. Best practice, though, is just like with committees. Vest the authority, review that on an annual basis or twice a year, decide if it's working correctly and if it's not, then make changes, as opposed to make changes after each decision is made along the way. And that gets back to, you know, an annual review is always good practice. Sit back, discuss at the board level, and then with management, what worked and what didn't work, you know? Was the board jumping into a number of decisions with a common theme throughout the year that had otherwise been delegated? And if that's the case, then have that open, honest, candid conversation and determine whether that delegation of authority makes sense. That's the annual review process, and it is good practice to do. Next slide, please. Working towards consensus. You'll never hear me say that every board should make every decision by unanimous decision, and that typically doesn't happen. Might more so in a private sense, especially if board members have been together for years and years and years. You know, when you've got 6 or 7 board members that have been on the same board together for 15 to 20 years, they tend to make more unanimous decisions because they're all completely aligned, and they've forced themselves to become completely aligned over the years. We have a different situation here. Board members are appointed for 6-year terms. Sometimes they last longer, sometimes, you know, it could be 7 or 8 years. But you know that there's going to be a refreshing of the board periodically. That brings new perspectives in, it brings new ideas in, it brings fresh lenses in, and all of that's very important. There's a reason why the curators are set up the way they are. The goal should always be, at the board level in discussions, to work toward consensus, understanding that you might not make it there. And what I mean by working towards consensus is really recognizing, look, we may not agree on this, but I'm going to go into the discussion with an open mind. I'm going to treat you with respect for your opinions, and I'm going to think about your opinions, and maybe we can carve a compromise, at least be open to a compromise in working toward a consensus decision. Again, not always going to get there, but you should be encouraging differing opinions. You should be patient and thinking about each person on this board's opinions and what is bringing them to make those opinions that differ from yours, and really reflect upon your position on any issue and whether or not consensus is a possibility. Questions? Next slide, please. Okay, education and reflection. I'm finding this out very quickly. It's impossible to know everything about the University of Missouri system. There's just too much. The tentacles are everywhere. It's an enormous institution with varying degrees and varying levels of different issues that are happening everywhere. Embrace that. Embrace the notion that you don't know everything. And when you do, as I do, that might lead you to try to develop your knowledge and increase your knowledge in various areas throughout the university system that you're not as knowledgeable about. I think comprehensive onboarding is essential at any board, and this board particularly, because of how varied the institution is. I haven't seen our onboarding process for new board members. It's something I would want to review at a certain point. But really, it needs to be tailored to the university system. It needs to educate new board members as to each element of the system, as opposed to assuming that they have a fundamental working knowledge of every aspect of this university. They don't, I guarantee it. Nobody does. And so that comprehensive onboarding is so important, not just to educate them about the system, but to educate them about the board, the perspectives that each board member brings, and some of the historical issues that have come up and the historical decisions that have been made, so that they come in with an understanding of how the board will work together. Attend industry events, always important. You can learn a lot about university and university systems by attending events. Seek those webinars at lunchtime webinars. We're a member of a number of groups that host lunchtime webinars that talk about university issues. It's something I'm going to try and fit in my schedule especially. Seek out experts. This is something we did at my last board quite a bit. There are various issues that it is nice to have a third-party independent expert come in and talk about, whether it be certain insurance issues or cybersecurity or maybe the latest Title IX issues or the NCAA, how that's evolving. We can educate ourselves on it, but sometimes it's nice to bring in an outside expert and give them your attention for an hour, and I think we all would benefit from it. Annual evaluations are always something that should be considered. And then reflect on your experience working on other boards. A lot of you, I'm sure, are on other boards, reporting to other boards, or have been on other boards. Think about what worked and what didn't work, and then bring that experience and those lessons to this board. We can all learn from it. And then finally, I highly encourage seeking comments, input from senior leaders in the organization when possible. They have their finger on the pulse of the university. They have a different perspective on how this university operates, how it could operate better, mistakes that have occurred in the past, if there are any. That discussion should be had on a continual basis, if possible. Next slide, please. Spend the remainder of the time on 2 slides on professionalism. I talked about the board's set of values when we started, and I'm going to go back to that just for a second. There's always a key element, as I said, in every set of values that a board puts together, and that's respect. Okay? Practicing respect is essential at the board level, internal to the board, and with the board's interaction with management. It has to be a two-way street, and in preparing this, I sat back and I thought about some of the ways that I've seen in my career board members not practice respect, I'll put it that way. And some of these things we're all guilty of and have been guilty of and probably will be guilty of again. And I'm not saying don't do this, you can't do this. What I am saying is, as you're doing it, you might reflect back on this discussion and think, maybe I didn't realize that doing this, sent the wrong message to management or to presenters or to my fellow board members, et cetera. So first, and this is in no particular order, if you can, it's not always possible, if you can, give the materials a pretty thorough review in advance of the meeting. That's going to tell you not just what's going to be discussed, but the flow of the discussion. It's going to allow you to think thoughtful questions in advance rather than off the cuff as you're hearing a presentation. And it's going to avoid knocking presenters off pace. And this is something I've seen quite a bit in my career. When somebody doesn't have time to read the materials, they'll show up to a meeting, a presenter will be giving their presentation, Ryan Rapp is giving his presentation, and somebody is stopping him and asking him questions because they don't realize the next 3 slides talk about that subject. It's natural. It happens all the time. But what that does is it knocks Ryan off his cadence. And now Ryan's moving on to a discussion topic that he had planned to naturally arrive at with the benefit of other information in front of it. And then he's jumping back and forth, and it's hard on the presenter. It's bad for the board because the board's not hearing a cohesive, cogent presentation, and things get missed. Happens all the time. And that can be avoided if you review the materials in advance. And if you don't review the materials in advance because for any reason whatsoever, be thinking about that before you ask the question. Maybe flip in the materials and say, all right, Ryan is going to get to this question in a minute, I'll hold. Along those lines, always important to give presenters your full attention. What I mean by that, and I'm guilty of this too, I've seen many people in board meetings, management side, board side, doing this. Okay. And maybe they're reading work email. Sometimes I'm doing that. Maybe they're checking the Cardinal score. Maybe they're looking at their stock portfolio. Maybe they're on Twitter. What they are doing is they're not giving their full attention to the presenter. And the person at the podium, as Ryan's giving his presentation, is trying to engage with you, and he sees this. And maybe that doesn't impact him in the moment, but maybe if he sees it over and over and over from several board members, he starts to think, what am I doing up here? Like, nobody's listening to me. Maybe what I'm doing isn't important. That's not good. It shows a lack of respect for Ryan and what he does for the university and what he's doing in his presentation for the board. And that can have a detrimental impact on the way the management interacts with the board. You want to have a healthy interaction. The other thing is, I'm going to give Ryan the benefit of the doubt that he prepared hard when he put his presentation together. Certainly didn't see any evidence of that this morning, but kidding. No, I know how hard presenters work on their presentations. We spend hours and hours and hours putting PowerPoints together and then going through those PowerPoints with our supervisors or with Dr. Choi or whoever it happens to be, fiddling with it, and then you're thinking about it all night, and you're not sleeping well because you're doing what I'm doing, and you got your piece of paper, and you're scratching notes on it at 2 in the morning, and don't forget to say this, don't forget to say something about Ryan. And then you get up there, you get up there, and it's important to you, right? You put a lot of time into it. And so, that two-way street of respect is really important. Management will feel it if they don't feel they have your full attention, and they'll feel a modicum of disrespect by that. And certainly every board wants to avoid that. I always avoid, and it very highly suggests the board avoid dressing down management during an open session. And I mean that every individual in management, whether it be Dr. Choi or somebody that reports up to Dr. Choi. You're going to have instances where you disagree with the output or with the presentation. You think it was sloppy or it didn't address something or it wasn't what you wanted, and you're probably right, or just assume you're right. However, what you don't realize is the person that's presenting probably got the green light and the check mark from their supervisor or Dr. Choi in preparing that document, and they're doing what they thought they were supposed to do. Avoid dressing them down because they might not have done anything wrong. They thought they were doing their job, and their boss said, this is what I want. Better practice, certainly if you want to maintain respect with management and the administration, is to wait and then have that offline conversation with Dr. Choi. Ryan did this and really not what we wanted. I'm sorry to pick on you, Ryan. Really isn't what we wanted. And frankly, I thought it was sloppy, and I thought this, that, or the other. And then Dr. Choi can say, you know what, he gave you exactly what I told him to. It's not his fault. Or Dr. Choi can take those comments and say, Ryan, I'd like to talk to you tomorrow, and we're going to talk about your work product. But it's Dr. Choi's duty, not this board's duty, to dress down management or lob critiques at them over their presentations. In much the same vein, I think it's good practice not to lob those critiques at Dr. Choi during an open session. He has people that are reporting to him in the room. Nobody wants to be dressed down in front of the people that report to them. It doesn't breed a good mutual respect. And then finally, I would say just one throw-off comment, that not all presenters are public speakers. Not everybody's as polished as Ryan. They didn't train for it. They don't do it very often. They've been thrown into a situation where they've spent a lot of time to get a presentation together. They're nervous. You don't see it at the podium, but their hand's shaking a little bit. This happens to me all the time, too, as you can probably tell. Have a little grace. Their full-time job isn't to be a public speaker. And just understand that as you're listening to them, and have the grace to afford them that modicum of respect. And then a couple last comments here about offhand comments and random queries. And Julia, tell me if this resonates with you, but it always starts like this, and it's a board member that's engaged in a discussion. That's a good thing. And they say, it would be really nice to know X, Y, Z. And then you move on. Somebody's writing that down. And if it's something you really want to know and you think it's important for the board, great. If it's just a throwaway comment, which happens a lot, understand that someone wrote that down, and now 3 hours of time is going to be spent finding out what XYZ is, and they're going to come to the next meeting with that answer for you. And maybe that's what you intended, and that's great, but if it's not, at least be thinking as you make those comments, you know what, I say that, but don't spend any time on it, or, spend an hour on it, but if you can't find the answer, then shut it down. Because there's an awful lot of work that goes on behind the scenes in preparing for board meetings, an awful lot of work. And the number of board meetings we have with the university, you get over the hill and then you start pushing that rock back up pretty quickly after the meeting. And so there's already your full-time job. There's the next meeting. Anything added to that, hopefully is an intentional question or comment that should be added to it. And then finally, this is more directed at management. The board deserves clear and professional materials, clear and professional presentations. They shouldn't be sloppy. They should be edited, they should be clean, they should be concise, not word vomit on a page that no one can follow. That should go to in an appendix, frankly. If you want to provide the information and make sure it's in the board book, word vomit goes in an appendix. Presentation should be clear and concise. Sharp and to the point, no sloppiness if it can be avoided. And I think, Dr. Choi, you would agree with that. I'm sure you review the materials before they come to the board level. So. Any points, questions, comments? I'm almost done. Last slide, please. Okay, confidentiality. Every board needs to be mindful that the materials it receives at any given time is confidential, or may be confidential, and should think about how they treat that material in keeping it confidential. I like to look at things on my iPad and on my phone. Some people bring laptops, some people have it printed out. Make sure you've got a passcode on your phone or on your iPad. I know it seems silly, but I've seen executives that I've worked with put a passcode into their laptop or into their iPad when I've brought this point up. And then I've seen those same executives make that passcode 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's like, come on, guys, this stuff can't get out, and you're making it way too easy. Make sure you've got a passcode on your stuff. Make sure it's not 1111 or something that's very easy to crack. If you print out materials, please don't leave them in your car at night, especially if your car's parked outside. You don't want that getting broken into and somebody stealing it. We've had that happen. And then discussions. Some discussions are confidential. There are a number of issues that come up at the board level that are in closed session for a reason. Those need to be kept confidential to the extent possible. It's very hard not to talk about issues when you're at a cocktail party or when you're with your family or friends, or you're at a restaurant with other board members or somebody else in management. Be cognizant of who's sitting around you. They're listening, especially if it's in Columbia. I guarantee they're listening. They know who you are. Just keep in mind your surroundings. As we sat down this morning, Curator Hoberock and I were talking, and we both looked at the microphones and said, we weren't talking about anything interesting, but we both had the thought, are these microphones on? And it's a good question to have. Who's listening? Make sure. Well, I wasn't going to bring it up. For instance, if you're on a Zoom and a meeting's about to start, you might think about that other people are on that Zoom meeting and they could be listening. That's theoretical, of course. Yeah. Next point, be very candid with management that reports to the board. Weaknesses, strengths. Analyze their and evaluate their performance and be open and honest with them. If Dr. Choi or I or whoever else that reports to the board is not doing a good job, be candid and let them know. And let them know in real time. I always said, I don't need attaboys, but if I'm doing something that you don't like, I want to know today. I don't want to know at review time a year from now, after I spend the next 11 months continuing to do the same mistake. Tell me in real time. I think it's important that management, we're all, senior executives, we deserve to know this in real time if we're doing something that the board doesn't approve of. We talked about communicating with direct reports under Dr. Choi. We talked about our surroundings. I think that's it.
Okay. Great information. Any questions or follow-up from Mark? There's a lot to think about there.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a question.
Yes.
And it goes back to committee authority and whether or not we want to go there or not. I'm asking a question, do you have a plan to address that, or are you thought about wanting to address that, or?
I think so. I say this, whatever we can do to be a better board, let's think about it. Let's consider it, and let's do what's best for us. So
Well,
what do you think?
I would suggest, again, we have a governance committee, and this, to me, becomes a governance issue, is to have the governance committee start having a dialogue with the administration on the concept of what authorities we want to either pull back and hold as a board, or what authorities we want to give committees to bless an action the administration wants to take. They're looking for guidance. And I don't have a specific outcome in mind, but I believe, based on listening to this presentation for the third time now, that deserves merit, and I would think that the governance committee would be a good place to start.
All right, if that's a motion, I'll second it. But Michael, go ahead. Let's
I'm
have
just
some
laughing
discussion.
because you're about to tell the get off my yard guy that, hey, you should consider whether we should change this. But nope, I think our committee would be more than happy to do that.
Any other thoughts?
We might need to change the committee membership before then.
Any questions?
Prerogative. Question, you mentioned creating a set of values, which I thought is something we've not done. Can you not hear me? Closer, sorry. About creating a set of values, which I thought is a really great point, and to my knowledge, not a part of a conversation I've ever had as a member of this board. Where do you see that falling? Under governance as well? A set of values for the board?
Are you talking about for the board or for each committee?
Board. That was kind of your initial slide.
I think it's governance, HR, out of the committees that we have, I think that's the most appropriate committee. I would say, let's start drafting it. If you guys want to do a set of values too, let's do it.
We will do those all at the same time. I'm looking at my committee people shake their heads. So.
Okay, great. But the reason I requested, as soon as, I think it was the first week you got here, Mark, I said, I'd like you to.
And it was 2 weeks before I started.
So 2 weeks before he started, we had him, you were already putting him to work, but I thought this would be a good presentation to have, just for the sake of, building relationships on the board, making sure that we are always in alignment with administration, making sure that we understand, respect each other, and that we can just be the best board we can be. So any other thoughts? I thought there were some, pretty interesting things there. Any good ideas? Anybody want to take any action on anything else, or evaluate further some of the?
I thought it was a great presentation and a great idea, Daryl, and I'm sorry, Chairman Chapman. And actually, I think from an ongoing standpoint, having an update on governance principles would be helpful. What's going on in, other university contexts, being educated, if you will, in terms of current governance topics and trends would be also helpful. I think the education part is maybe an area that we could, have some ongoing, continuous learning that we'll benefit from as well.
When we talked about that last summer, you all may remember, how do we take a deep dive into topics? I think we talked about that at the retreat, and I think this kind of circles back to that same point, that we can't get it all done in a meeting. and we give short shift to have a 10 or 15-minute presentation on something that we do need to bring an expert, or we need to bring someone in from administration to talk about something at 3 or 4. I mean, some things really need to be, worked through. So I think this really lines up to a conversation we had prior, but hopefully lets us move off, first base and get rolling on it.
Yeah, and if we're not spending all the time doing everybody's committee work, it's, frees us up to spend time in different ways like that. I love it.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, so it sounds as though we've got some action here for the governance committee. Number one, draft a set of values, maybe start with 5 points that we can have as a board. And then routine items, to work with administration to determine if there's some routine items. There may be none, there may be a list of 10, as Mark said, but let's work on developing that list of routine items so that we can think about actually delegating authority to our committees in order to expedite work and get things done. Yes, Julie?
Could we also delegate to the new general counsel, if you have any best practices to propose in terms of the types of delegated authorities to university committees, that would be helpful to educating us in terms of what best practices may be, maybe a click down in terms of specificity.
And I think before we forwarded some AGB materials on this, I'll look and see if they have some updated kind of things for board values and delegation.
Okay, great. And I think, Cindy, we had talked about, and you may already do this, Cindy. Cindy does a great job showing us professional development opportunities, especially with AGB. But if there's monthly webinars or seminars or whatever they may be, have you been forwarding those to us? Or if you can, I think that'd be great opportunities for board members to be able to, at least get different options as far as what to see to help us all be better board members.
And I do receive notices like that from AGB for lunch hour webinars,
Okay.
things like that. A lot of them are complimentary as well.
Okay.
So, yeah, I can be more cognizant of those and share those as well.
And we do get publications, and I do get publications in the mail. I think all of us probably do. But anything we can to, like I said, help us be a better board. So not to say that there's any problems or anything. I'm just we're always trying to be better no matter how good you are. So, all right. So thank you, Mark. Anybody else got any further questions? Okay. So we are now to the good and welfare of the board. Are there any items for the good and welfare of the board? Okay, if none, I'd entertain a motion and a second from the board to move into executive session.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion on that? We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, Cindy, please call the roll.
Curator Burnsick,
Yes?
Curator Chapman,
Yes?
Curator Graves,
Yes.
Curator Hobrock,
Yes.
Curator Holloway,
Yes.
Curator Lehman,
Yes.
Curator Winokur,
Yes.
Curator Williams.
Yes.
All right. All votes in favor.
All right, the motion carries. So before we leave, the board would like to thank Susan, Mike. Susan and Mike, please stand up.
And the entire team
And the entire team, please stand up.
from MVP. Yeah, please stand.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. This team travels with us to each board meeting, and we appreciate all of the hard work you guys do in projecting slides and enabling individuals to join us by live stream. We know it's not an easy task, and just thank you so much for everything that you do for us during our meetings. Thank you. All right. Okay, this concludes the public session of our board meeting today. The board thanks everyone for their time and reports. President Choi and I will be available during the press conference, which will occur in a few minutes. Say we get back together as a board, 30 minutes, maybe at 2 o'clock, Cindy?
I think that sounds good. 2 o'clock?
Okay, we'll get back and reconvene for
Silver and
executive session at 2 o'clock.
Yes, I'm sorry. Executive session is in the silver and gold room,
Okay.
which is back towards the stairwell.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate it.